Let us pray. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, you who are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, I know I'm not alone in being a Star Wars fan. In fact, well over 125 million American adults say that they are either a casual or avid fan of this franchise. Last year, the website GameSpot had an online article about the 20 most pivotal scenes in Star Wars movie history. And so, that would have captured my attention. It's a great article for any Star Wars fan. I'm going to skip to the top 5 for this morning. Needless to say, major spoilers ahead, although I would think that if you haven't watched the Star Wars movies by now, that's on you, right? Not on me. So here we go. Number 5, Order 66. This is from Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Anakin is the apprentice of the evil Emperor Palpatine. The Secret Order, Order 66, is programmed into the clones. Now, up until this point, the clones had been working with the Jedi as battle enforcements, but now they're programmed to see the Jedi as enemies, and virtually every remaining Jedi in the galaxy is eliminated, killed, murdered, including the youngest of the Jedi. The 4th most pivotal scene is from the film that started it all, Star Wars: A New Hope, Episode 4, and that's the death of Luke Skywalker's aunt and uncle. Luke had been invited by Obi-Wan Kenobi to join him in learning the ways of the Force and leaving Tatooine, but Luke declines, saying that his responsibilities at home with Uncle Ben and Aunt Beru are keeping him there. Well, he returns home to find that they have been brutally murdered, and there's now nothing left for him there, and so Luke's path as a Jedi begins. The number 3 most pivotal scene is from Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. Darth Vader turns against his master, Emperor Palpatine, and having just defeated Darth Vader in combat, but refusing to kill him, Luke tosses his lightsaber aside, symbolically saying that I will never join the dark side. And Palpatine then turns his attention on Luke with that Force lightning that was so cool back in the 80s when they first had it at the beginning of Industrial Light and Magic's special effects. And then, because he's zapping him, Darth Vader then takes over and goes against his master to save Luke and bring balance to the Force. The 2nd most pivotal scene is from Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, when Yoda lifts Luke's X-Wing out of the swamps of Dagobah. Luke's been training with the Jedi Master Yoda on the remote planet of Dagobah, but was so frustrated that he couldn't get that whole Force thing down and couldn't do anything that seemed to be significant. And frustrated that he couldn't lift his ship out of the swamp when it got stuck. Well, thinking it to be an impossible task, Luke is stunned when the diminutive Yoda does just that and proves that size doesn't matter, that with the Force, virtually nothing is impossible. And then the most pivotal scene in the Star Wars franchise comes from Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. In his first battle with the evil Lord Vader, Luke is easily beaten. And having lost both his right hand and his lightsaber, Luke retreats to this catwalk that you see in the middle of the Death Star. And it's there at that moment that Vader reveals the shocking truth that he is Luke's father. I mean, it stunned moviegoers across the globe, and it changed the course of the Star Wars franchise forever. Welcome to the 2nd week in our 2-week series called For Such a Time as This. And the title of the series comes from the pivotal scene, or at least the beginnings of the pivotal scene in the book of Esther, which is the story of our heroine, Esther. Now, to briefly recap where we've been in our previous episode, allow me to summarize. In the Persian Empire, King Ahasuerus ruled over 127 provinces from India all the way to Ethiopia. Now, the one thing that the king was really good at, aside from expanding his borders, was throwing a party. Loved parties, and would also throw parties on top of parties, after parties, and had lots of food and lots to drink. Well, after one excessive string of parties, in fact, over 6 months long of parties, The king summons his queen, Queen Vashti, to come and parade before all the guys that he's drinking with. Why? Because she was so stunningly beautiful. Well, she had things to do and people that she was responsible for, so she politely declines, and the king banishes her from the kingdom. Well, his advisors cook up a plan to get the next queen for the king under the guise of a beauty pageant. And they decide to go and bring young virgins, single women from all over the 127 provinces back to the capital of Susa. They will have 12 months of beauty treatments. And then among those that were brought to the capital was an orphaned Hebrew girl named Esther. She had been raised by her cousin Mordecai. Mordecai loved Esther as his own daughter, and when her parents died, in fact, he took her in and cared for her. And then when she went to the city of Susa in order to be a part of this beauty search, Mordecai relocated to be close to Esther as well. He couldn't be in the palace where she was, but he stayed outside the king's gate and checked on her every single day. And everyone who saw Esther was drawn to her. There was something about her, including the king. He was so impressed that he named her the new queen. Meanwhile, the king promotes his second in command, Haman, and everyone has to bow down when Haman walks by. And everyone does, except the guy you see sitting on the wall there, Mordecai, Esther's adopted father. Well, this ruffles Haman's feathers so much that he decides not to deal with Mordecai by himself. No. He finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, and he plots to kill every single Jew in the entire 127 provinces of the king. And that's where we left off. So on to today's exciting conclusion. We're back in the Old Testament in the book of Esther, starting in chapter 4. If you have the church app, you can click on the Bible link on the home page, and then when you get to that, click on Read Bible. It'll take you right to Esther chapter 4. If you're here in the sanctuary, you can grab the red Bibles in front of you, and we're going to be beginning on page 446. 446 in the Pew Bibles as well. Or if you're following along at home and you don't have a Bible with you, we'll be showing the verses on the screen as well. So Esther chapter 4, beginning at verses 1 and 2. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, that is, Haman's plot to have all the Jews killed, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went through the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. So there are moments in one's life when unjust decisions must be resisted, no matter where those decisions originate from. And such was the case for Mordecai. He heard the news about all of his fellow Jewish Hebrew countrymen and countrywomen that will soon be annihilated, and he couldn't stand by and do nothing. So what does he do? He goes to what he knows. The Jewish response for mourning and protest is to put on sackcloth and ashes and to wail, publicly express your outrage, but also his desire that God would come and intervene on his behalf. Verse 4. When Esther's maids and her eunuch came and told her what had happened, the queen was deeply distressed. So she sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Now, remember last week we found out that Mordecai told Esther when she goes to the palace and is entered into that contest to be the next queen, not to reveal her ethnic heritage as being Jewish. Now, the Persian Empire, as you saw from the map a few moments ago, was a global superpower at this time. And one of the ways that when they conquered a nation, they would bring some of the best and the brightest from different parts and mix them around. So in the capital of Susa, undoubtedly, there were a number of ethnic groups, religious groups, and cultures that were all living there together. So maybe the queen thought that Mordecai's distinctive Jewish actions would somehow reflect poorly on her as the queen, maybe undermine some of the authority she had, or maybe she just hated to see him suffer because he obviously was in distress, and sackcloth is not the most comfortable of fashion to wear, believe me. Anyway, she's trying to get him to change his tactics. Mordecai would not be swayed. So Esther sent one of her servants, Hathach, to try and talk some sense into Mordecai at the gate. And what we follow is sort of like a junior high game of pass the note, back and forth between Esther and Mordecai with this servant. Mordecai tells Esther about the decree that had been issued by Haman for the destruction of all of the Jews. This is the first that Esther had heard of it. He begs Esther to plead with the king to reverse this devastating ruling. Esther sends back a note saying, hey, you can't just walk into the king. You have to be summoned. And it's been 30 days since I've been summoned to be in the king's presence. If you walk in, you will die. That's the law. Verse 12 to 14. When they told Mordecai what Esther has said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Here's the note going back. Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. I mentioned last week that Esther is one of just 2 books in the Bible that doesn't specifically mention God by name. The other is the Song of Solomon. Now, if that's bothersome for you, if you think, well, why is the book afraid to mention God's name? And maybe we shouldn't be reading this. Well, here's another bit of trivia that our music leader and director, Don, brought to my attention this past week. Did you know that there is a little ditty in the Christian music world? Actually, it's a hymn that most people have heard of before, Amazing Grace. It also does not mention God anywhere specifically. And yet, Amazing Grace is probably held up by many as one of the greatest Christian hymns of all time. Definitely one of the most comforting hymns, right? It is filled, saturated with God, even though God is not specifically mentioned by name. Same with this story. As we'll see, there are tons of God moments, even if God's name is not penned on the paper. So to me, these words of Mordecai, they're marinating in God. And this powerful statement, he says, he acknowledges all the pain of Esther's past, but also the future possibilities. And disaster is coming, he says, to all of us who are Jewish. But if you don't rise up, something will happen. Someone else, deliverance will come from some other area. Now, he doesn't say what kind of deliverance, who will lead that, but the implication is God's going to find a way to save us. It's going to come from somewhere. And who knows, he says, maybe you have been brought to this point for just such a time as this. I say this all the time. You're probably sick of me saying it, that I don't believe in that phrase, everything happens for a reason. I believe that we are people who have free will, that God is not the puppet master up in the heavens that is making every single thing happen, like God is playing a video game and working out the scenario. No, I think God gave us free will. We make choices, others make choices, and then we have to live with the repercussions of our choices, or we have to live with the choices that others make that we have no influence over. But through it all, I believe that God can take anything that happens in our lives and in the world and use it for something good. Can change the impact that has had for something good in our lives for such a time as this. I think this is where the power of this story is happening. And we have to connect in our own lives as well, right? Through the choices that we or others have made. Things that we've experienced, I think that God can change and bring to something good. The cancer bout that we've been through. The heartbreaking loss of a relationship. The pink slip that we were given at work. Or the family challenges that we've endured. When faced with a difficult situation in life, instead of getting depressed and frozen by fear, could it be possible that maybe God is bringing us to this point for just such a time as this? And so I encourage you today and maybe in the next few days that follow, as part of your devotion and reflection and your your study time, your connection with God. Maybe look back over the last few days, weeks, months, years, and some of the events that have happened in your life, and see if you can find the invisible hand of God that's been guiding and directing and leading you to this place. How does Esther respond? Verse 15 to 17. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So when faced with this impending horrific atrocity, Esther chooses to trust God, to turn to God for strength and guidance and direction. And she decides to spend time praying and fasting, a very biblical experience of connecting to God. But she's not doing it by herself. She's not saying, "Oh, I'm the queen and I'm so powerful, I'll just handle this on my own, I'll be superwoman again." No. She asks for Mordecai to have the community of faith walk alongside her, to also pray with her, and to fast with her, and to give her the strength to do whatever it is that God is calling her to do. And it's a great insight because we need each other, friends. Christianity is not a solo sport. That's why we have life groups and senior ministries and youth group and the men's group and other gatherings. We need each other. Life was meant to be in community. We can't make it on our own. Esther knew that. Esther knew that. So she finishes her communication at this point with Mordecai by saying, "You know what? When I'm done with that, after the 3 days, I will approach the king without being summoned. And it may cost me my life, but at this point, this is what I think that I have to do." She knows what is right. She has to stand up against this injustice. And this is that pivotal moment in the story. This is that pivotal scene, the beginning of what will change the entire course of the Esther story. And from this moment in the story, Esther moves from literally being a beauty queen to becoming the queen, to becoming a salvific, a saving force in the life of not just her own life, but the entire community. So, 3 days of prayer and fasting are over. Esther approaches the king. Chapter 5, verses 2 and 3. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. And he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. The king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you even to the half of my kingdom." And this is the pattern that we've seen all throughout the story of Esther. Whenever she encounters someone new, people are just drawn to her. There's something about her. And even though the king had not summoned for her to come, and even though she faced the possibility of losing her life, when she was in his presence, he was just drawn to her. And so he extended his scepter. She was not put to death. And he says, "What is it that you want? I'll give you whatever you ask, even up to half my kingdom." Now remember, this is a big kingdom, but what was the theme last week? All about excess and extremes, right? Maybe she's not going to ask for half the kingdom. Why are you going to give it away so quickly, king? I don't know. That's just how he rolled. By the way, this is the first time in the entire story that the narrator refers to her as Queen Esther. She is being very royal on this behalf as she is interceding on behalf of her people and standing up against an injustice. Verse 4. Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for the king." Now, we saw last week how much the king loves a good banquet. The more the merrier, the longer the better. Keep the alcohol flowing and everything is good. So Esther invites him and his right-hand man, second in command, Haman, to come to a feast. And what's the saying? The way to a man's heart is often through his stomach. I don't think it took Esther very long to figure that out with her husband. The banquet is prepared. They sit down to eat. And then the king wants to know, "All right, why have you brought us here? I'm so eager to find out. What is it that you want?" Verse 7. Then Esther said, "This is my petition and request. If I have won the king's favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to a banquet that I will prepare for him, and then I will do as the king has said." So how do you follow up one great meal? You have another, right? And the king is all about the after parties anyway. And so Esther says, if you had a great time, come again tomorrow night. And tomorrow night, I'll let you know why I've called you here. Now, we may be wondering, is she stalling? Is she not really sure what to say? Is she not sure how to share her plight and the plight of her people with the king, especially with the man who orchestrated the entire destruction sitting in the same room? Or could it be that the hand of God is at work at this moment, and Esther knows she needs to say this, but it just didn't feel right. And so God is leading her to that right moment at when to say it. As you might imagine, getting invited to back-to-back banquets by the queen left Haman feeling pretty good about himself. I'm sure he was walking on clouds as he exited the palace, thinking it's just me and the king and the queen. We are like 3 peas in a pod. This is amazing. And as he's walking out, everybody's bowing down. He's feeling so good about himself until they get to the place where Mordecai is outside, and Mordecai refuses to bow. And it infuriates him again. He's like, Mordecai, right? But instead of dealing with one person, he just leaves and seething and so angry. When he gets home, he tells his wife and his friends what had happened. Verse 14. Then his wife, Zeresh, and all of his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the banquet in good spirits. This advice pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. I mean, nothing gets you ready for a good party like a hanging, right? I mean, what is this, the Wild West again? No. And it's interesting, though. Remember last week in chapter 1 at the end of the party when the queen refused to come, his advisors told the king, we have to make this royal edict that said every man should be master of his house. And here's Haman. Who's master of the house? I think it's his wife. She's the one that's telling him what to do and how to do it, right? Now, as we mentioned last week, instead of thinking of a hangman's gallows, the Hebrew word really connotes a giant spike. So instead of being hanged like we think of in a Western, the victims would have been impaled on the spike as a gruesome warning to all around, don't mess with the king. Now, 50 cubits high would be the equivalent of a 7-story building, about 75 feet tall. And again, excesses and extremes, right? I mean, that is a huge spike that would be seen all over the entire town for everyone to know. And remember, Mordecai is already a condemned man. On the 13th day of the 12th month, he and every other Jew in all 127 provinces are going to be executed. But Haman can't wait that long. His anger has taken over so much that he has to have Mordecai dead sooner. So he builds this 75-foot tall spike to have him impaled the next morning. Which brings us to the next God moment in this book where God's name isn't specifically mentioned at all. So that very night, the king in his palace is having trouble sleeping. Now, that happens to all of us, right, from time to time. Maybe you ate some spicy foods, or maybe there's just something bothering you, whatever. You can't get to sleep and have a nice, 8 to 10 hours like you would hope. So what does the king do when he can't sleep? Does he grab his remote and click over to Netflix and catch up on some of those shows that he's behind on? Does he go to the royal kitchen and maybe devour an entire tray of double chocolate brownies? Does he call a few young ladies from his harem to come in and help him pass the night away? No. He decides to read, or to have things read to him. I'm guessing he wanted the most boring book that he had in his whole kingdom come so that it would put him to sleep as it was being read. And so he calls for the king's book of records, otherwise known as the Annals of the King. Now, make sure you get the timing that's going on here, right? The king is having a problem sleeping the very same night that over at Haman's house, he and his wife and his friends are deciding to have that big spike built so the next morning he can get permission from the king to impale Mordecai. Now, what do you think the king came across as he was reading his book of records? Well, it just so happens that a while ago there was an assassination attempt on the king's life, and some Jewish guy named Mordecai heard about it, told the queen, and they discovered it was true, and those two traitorous guards of the king were put to death. Esther 6, verse 3. Then the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing. Nothing has been done for him. Nothing has been done for him. And if you remember last week, we were wondering, why is it that this person just saves the king's life and nothing is mentioned about honoring the king? Well, it wasn't the right time. But now it is. In chapter 6, it's the right time. In Greek, it's called the kairos moment, right? There's regular time, chronological time, and then there's God's time. Kairos moment. This is the moment that is drenched with God, and things happen at a particular time because God is helping to work towards that. Well, it just so happens morning is broken, and the big spike has been constructed, and Mordecai, without being summoned, comes to the king's presence. He doesn't enter the throne room. He just stands outside the throne room because he knows the rule. You come in without being called, and it's death, even to the right-hand man of the king. The king looks down his hallways, and he sees off in the distance Mordecai. Oh, perfect. Or not Mordecai, sorry, Haman. Perfect. Haman, come on in. I've got something that I want to ask you. Now, we know why Haman is there. He wants to ask the king to have Mordecai impaled on the spike outside by his house. We know why the king wants Mordecai to come in, because the king is trying to figure out how's he going to honor this guy named Mordecai that helped him foil an assassination plot a while ago. Verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" Haman thought to himself, "Who would the king wish to honor more than me?" So how ironic is this, right? Haman is so full of himself, so thinking that he is all that in a bag of chips. The only possible explanation he can think of as to why the king is asking him is that the king wants him to pick out his own reward. I mean, who else gets to come to dinner with the queen and the king twice in a row, right? It must be me. Haman says, well, let's see. I think you should start with one of the king's royal horses. Yes, put this man on the royal horse, and a crown as well. Now, the Hebrew is not clear as to whether the crown is for the man or the horse, but still, he's on a roll. Don't stop him yet. And a parade. Yes, a royal parade. And then everyone will know this is the man that the king wishes to honor. Verse 11, 10 and 11. Then the king said to Haman, "Perfect. Quickly go, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to the Jew Mordecai that sits out at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse and robed Mordecai, and we have to add the word reluctantly, I'm sure, led Mordecai with him riding through the open square of the city, proclaiming, "Thus it shall be for the man who the king wishes to honor." And he had to keep saying that all parade long. It kind of seems that the king maybe has never read that edict that Haman had written, because he would have made that connection between the Jew, Mordecai, and the Jewish destruction of all the Jewish people. And remember when Haman told him about this, there's these people that they don't obey any of your laws, and they're very rude and unruly and all that. He never said what group of people it was. And just think, if Haman hadn't been so eager to have Mordecai impaled the very next day, and if he wouldn't have built such a tall spike in the city, and if he wouldn't have been there first thing to get the king's permission to have him impaled, I don't think the king would have come up with the same reward as Mordecai, or as Haman did, right? Haman's thinking about himself. Here's what I want. Let's see. I'll take a royal crown, a royal horse, a royal robe. Like, maybe he wanted to be the king himself. I mean, you got all that. What's left? The royal queen, and then you got the whole trifecta or quadruple fecta, whatever it is. And everything backfired on Haman. He left that day embarrassed, depressed, and this is what happened when he got home. Verse 13, when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, oh, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman off to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Oh, wait, Jewish, you say? You didn't tell us he was Jewish. Oh, yeah, if he's Jewish, you got no shot. Like, there's no way you can overcome him, she says. And then, before he can even think about the implications of this, the royal servants come and escort Haman off to royal banquet number 2. Now, by this time, I'm sure some of his anger and disappointment and embarrassment is wearing off. I mean, hey, it's he and the king and the queen dining together again, just them. He's still second in command. He's still all that. So I guess life isn't that bad after all. And they're having this wonderful meal. And then the king gets around to say, all right. It's been killing me. Esther, please tell us. What is it that you wanted? Why did you come in yesterday morning? What request do you have? Chapter 7, verse 3. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me. That's my petition, and the lives of my people, this is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. I mean, if we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate the king for this damage. And her speech is brilliant. We talked last week about the wordplay between enslaved and destroyed. The words sound very similar, but they're spelled differently. And she's reminding the king about the edict that Haman had signed and that he had agreed to. Obviously, though, he didn't read the fine print. He just clicked accept, right? Had we been simply sold as slaves, she says, I wouldn't have said anything. But this is an economic blow to the king. For all of us to be killed, man, that's really going to impact your bottom line. Verse 5. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? Who has presumed to do this? And Esther said, a foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And now, as the saying goes, the chickens are coming home to roost, right? The queen has built up this dramatic tension, and it culminates with a finger pointing to the second in command, Haman himself. And the narrator, yeah, I love the subtlety of this. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Dun, 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 dun. Verse 7. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. I mean, he knew it. As soon as he saw the king's eyes, he knew he was done for. And so, always trying to make the best of a tricky situation, Haman figures he's only got one card left to play. And that's to beg the queen for mercy, to ask for forgiveness. And so the king has gone outside for a timeout. I'm guessing his mom taught him when he was younger, you got to count to 10 before making any rash decision. But then we think back to that party when he got really drunk and he divorced his wife just because she wouldn't come. And we think, yeah, that's probably not the way he operates. Anyway, while he's out, Haman knows his only shot is to fall on the mercy of the king. And literally that's what he does. He flings himself onto the king's bed, verse 8, or couch. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? And as the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. What a wonderful expression, right? As soon as it was spoken, Haman knew that he was done. Now, for once, Haman is actually trying to be a stand-up guy. He's being honest, he's being humble, he's being contrite, he's seeking to beg mercy from the queen. But the king walks in on this and assumes the worst, assumes that he's grasping to try to physically assault the queen. And at that moment, his fate is sealed. And Queen Esther doesn't have to say a thing. Verse 9, then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, oh, look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and then the anger of the king abated. Right? What goes around comes around. The servant is standing there looking out the window at this monstrosity spike that everybody can see because it's 75 feet tall, and says, oh, what about that giant spike over there? In fact, didn't you build that? Weren't you trying to impale Mordecai, the guy that saved the king? And the king's like, oh, yeah, that'll work. Take him over there. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200 or 10,000 talents of silver, whatever it is that the story was saying. The end. Now, had Haman built a little bit smaller spike, maybe the servant wouldn't have seen it. Maybe wouldn't have suggested that. Who knows? But that's how the story goes, right? The story of excess and extremes, and this is what happened to Haman. Now, after Haman's death, the king gets his signet ring back, the ring that caused so much trouble in the beginning. What does he do? He gives it away again. This time he makes Mordecai second in command and says, here, take my ring. Do whatever you want. And he says, well, the first thing we'd like to do is erase that other edict that Haman had. And he's like, oh, I'm so sorry. Once it's been stamped with my ring, there are no takebacks at all. And so Esther and Mordecai work together in order to craft a second edict that goes out and says, on the 13th day of the 12th month, Jews all over the nation are welcome to defend themselves against attack from anyone that would seek to do them harm. The celebration that happened after this experience became the Jewish festival of Purim. It's devised from the Persian word for casting lots, which is the randomness that Haman chose the day in which this purge would take place. And they turned that negative into a positive. And so every year the Jewish community celebrates Purim. And guess what they do? They have a party. They have a big feast, but it also is involved with sharing your food with the poor. And that's how they remember the story of Esther. There you have it. It's an amazing, incredible, fabulous story. I told you it was totally worth the price of admission. It's a story of a strong, self-confident woman who maximizes every power that she's given within her society and within her own person. Right? By beauty and charm, she becomes the queen. She keeps her ethnicity hidden per Mordecai's request. She takes it upon herself the dangerous and risky position of approaching the king when she's not called upon. And but first, she spends time with the community and God in prayer and in fasting. She waits to make her request to the king at just the right moment, which gives Haman enough rope to hang himself or enough spike to impale himself, you might say. And she saves her people from death, destruction, and annihilation. And through the wisdom of her adopted father, Mordecai, Esther comes to realize that everything in her life, even the horrible tragedies that have happened along the way, have been leading to just such a time as this. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we're going through? What are some of the struggles and the challenges and the difficulties that we may have in our own life, in our family, in our community, in the world? How can the story of Esther encourage us not to be discouraged, not to give up, not to think that all is lost and it looks like there's no way out or around this situation? Maybe God is leading us to this place for just such a time as this. How ironic, isn't it, that from one of the two books in the Bible that never mention God, that it is so filled with God moments. May each of us be able to see those God moments, those kairos moments in our own lives. And may we draw close to God in prayer and through this community of faith together as Palmdale United Methodist Church, as we worship, as we sing, as we pray, as we're in small groups together. May we walk alongside each other as we're all going through these challenges, knowing and believing beyond a shadow of a doubt that God is and will continue to work for good in our lives and in the world around us. And all God's people said, Amen.